The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. And today I'm so happy to welcome back to the show for the first time in many years, Brigitte Webster. Brigitte, welcome back.
Hello. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be back. And I can't believe it's been that long.
It has been a long time. I need to go back and see, but it's been quite a few years. I've been doing the podcast now for 8 years. So I'm going to say maybe 6 years at the most that it's been since we talked, but maybe 4.
Yeah. Well, we measure our success not in years, but lifetimes.
There we go. I like that. Well, I invited Brigitte here today because she has a book called Eating with the Tudors that just kind of fascinates me because I feel like this is a subject we don't really talk about very much when it comes to Tudor life. We talk about relationships and love and battles, but we forget about the thing that helps these people grow. The food. And so, Brigitte, I really want to know, what gave you the idea to do a book on food and the Tudors?
That is a simple question to answer. I was actually approached by the publisher. It all happened out of nowhere in the middle of lockdown. I think it was 2020. And it seems that one of the editors had been following me and thought, right, there is actually some interest in here. People seem to like what she's posting about her Tudor recipes. Tudor in itself always sells. So they offered me the opportunity to write a book about Tudor food, but also combine it with recipes and preferably include the original 16th century recipe, modernize it, and then tell a little bit about the ingredients or the dish itself, what made it special, who consumed it, when and why. And I thought, yeah, that's got my name on it. So
I'm curious. So has cooking and food always been an interest for you? What got you to do your first Tudor recipe?
Right. Now, before I answer that question, I'd just like to make it known that I am of a certain age where it was absolutely essential that as a young woman, you had to learn how to cook. I was born and raised in Austria, which even in the 80s was still very traditional. And to my parents, it was absolutely vital that I learned and was confident in cookery. So they sort of talked me into becoming a teacher. And in Austria, the system is a little bit different. You have to choose 2 different subjects you're going to teach. And so I opted for history, which was my passion. And as my practical subject, I chose cookery because I thought, well, that makes the parents happy. But at that stage, I wasn't really interested in cooking or recipes at all. I actually failed to see that the two could actually merge together into one beautiful new skill. So that was basically how it all started. I then met my husband, who's English, and so I ended up here on this beautiful island called England. And I applied for a job as a teacher, and they said, right, okay, we don't want you to teach history. We've got plenty of those. There really isn't any demand for recipes either, but we do always need native speakers to teach the language. So sadly, I ended up wasting 25 years, precious years, on teaching German. but I always tried to smuggle in making the students do a bit of cookery, recipes in the German language, or if I could, even a historic little recipe. So I started a few years into teaching thinking, that really works. People like that. People like to study a recipe based on the history, who made it, why did they do it like that. And but it was only an online course. Some of you might remember the Future Learn courses when they first started, which is now, I think, also 8 years ago, something like that. Anyway, when they first started, they offered one course which was on royal cooking or royal recipes, something to do with royalty in England. And I thought, that sounds interesting. So I signed up, and on that course, I met one of my mentors, I say. It was actually two elderly ladies, American, who were very much professional in that field, and they spotted me because I don't know, something on that course sparked it off, and I really got into it. So they contacted me and they guided me from the start, and they were the first ones who pointed out to me that it was really, really important to work with the original primary source. So to completely forget about secondary books. So any modern cookery books, even if they claim they are recipes from Shakespeare's time or Tudor cookery, if they do not include the original recipe, they can't be trusted. I thought, that's interesting. Let's check it out. So I started to look into authentic recipes. And I was actually amazed how many I could find, even online. But obviously, again, most of them were transcribed. So again, I had to be careful because people don't always transcribe things quite by the rule, or, leave things out or add things. But it was a start. And so I started going to various libraries to actually involve myself in the real thing. And I got very, very excited, really excited. But then there was another problem. Anybody who's ever looked at 16th century handwriting, will understand that if you haven't studied paleography, you're stuck. You are stuck so fast. And that was a big problem for me. And in the beginning, I therefore had to consult transcriptions and compare them, with the text. And I started to teach myself quite a bit, but I quickly found that, no, I've got to learn paleography. There's no way around it. So I did. And luckily here in England, local libraries, they always run numerous courses on how to read paleography, and I absolutely enjoyed it, really did. Such a gift as well to be able to decipher those texts. And so I started cooking from those recipes, and I have to confess that if you're not a confident cook, you probably look at those recipes and you think, what in the world is this? It doesn't mention any ingredients. It doesn't mention how to prepare it. All it tells me that you should do this and that, which sometimes has nothing to do with the cooking process. Because what we mustn't forget is that 16th century recipes were geared at confident cooks, people who knew how to cook, All they needed was a sort of aid memoir that possibly gave them new ideas. This is a new dish, this is a new fashion, has just arrived from the continent. That's how you do it. But all the very basics, which we in the 21st century rely on, they ditched them because it wasn't necessary. So it is enormously helpful if you are a confident cook who understands the very basics of cookery, what works, what doesn't work, which ingredients do you need, and more importantly, how much of each one of the ingredients do you need? Because these early recipes often give you no idea, no indication. Or they will tell you, okay, use 4 eggs and then use milk and then use flour and then use this. And you think, well, if I don't know the proportions, what good is it? Yeah, so there is a lot of trial and error involved. But to me, it's a little bit of an adventure. I absolutely love cooking those recipes where, when you look at them, you think, never in this world is this going to work. What is it? What am I going to end up with? Those are my favorite ones because often they surprise me the most.
Do you remember the very first recipe you did?
Uh, let me think. It was one on that course, that online course. And I think the first one was a pie filled with, there were 2 pies, a green peas pie, and the other one was an early cheese type pie.
Oh.
They were quite good, but obviously I did not understand the whole context then, because that's very important as well. When you really go into Tudor recipes, you've got to understand the whole context that involves the politics, the economics, social history, to place it into where it should be, because by doing that can you fill in a lot of the gaps that the recipe presents you with. And you also must totally understand the changes between 1500 and 1600, because it's quite something how much cookery changed within those 100 years. So knowing what date the recipe is from also helps you place the various bits and pieces together that in the end make sense and produce hopefully a nice tasty dish.
It sounds to me, Brigitte, like you like a good challenge.
When it comes to Tudor recipes, definitely. But I always prefer to pick my challenges rather than having them thrown at me.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, for those who are listening, let's maybe just go back to even the basics of cooking in the world of the Tudors and food. If there is somebody who's just an average subject, they're not from a noble family, but they need to feed their family. Let's say they live in London, right? So they're in the city, but they're not royal. How do they go about getting the food that they need?
Right. You have just raised a very interesting point. London, not noble. Now, before I tell you much about the food they would have bought and where, 2 things. We would have to know exactly from which group of people these Londoners are, because if you're talking at the about people at the very bottom of society, they would not even have had anywhere to cook. they would have had a room, but no facility for cooking. So they were totally dependent on what I always refer to as the Tudor equivalent to the McDonald's, which were basically food stalls which were open, almost 24 hours a day, every day for those people. And they sold cheap, probably not very nice or high quality pies or pottages. And that's what people at the very bottom, without cooking facilities, had to have every day. And obviously you have then the merchants, which started to be quite noticeable in that time period. They were not noble, but wealthy. And it wouldn't surprise you to hear that they tried very hard to imitate the nobility in what they ate and how much of it they put on the table. So it was all about showing off. Hey, look at me. I've got the money. I can put onto the table food that nobility and royalty can afford. I can as well. Okay, I haven't got a title, but I'm going to look for one by choosing my wife from the nobility. But yes, so that is a very interesting aspect as well. And obviously merchants would not have cooked themselves, especially not in London. They would have had somebody to cook their food for them in their own kitchen. And the kitchen staff would have bought their food fresh from the markets. In those days, you could get your produce fresh every single day from various markets. You had special fish markets, meat markets, butchers, fish markets, vegetable markets. So yes, it probably took you all morning to get your ingredients for that day, but I suppose it was part of the process, and people quite enjoyed getting out a bit.
Yeah, well, I didn't know anything about that. So now I'm curious. We know that they lived by different standards than we do today because we have refrigerators and ways to store our food. So when we look at the four seasons, let's stick with these same people in London. Okay, let's stick with the lower class people who don't have a kitchen to cook in London. How are they still going about eating in the winter? Or how are these street feeders, I don't know what to call them, like food truck people in the streets of London, how are they getting the food to these people at that point?
Right. They were all about making a profit. Yeah.
Yeah.
No surprise. So they would have got their food from places where they could get them really cheap from. That means probably at the end of a market's trading day. You know, it's still the case now. When you go to the market at the end of a trading day, you get bargains. That's very much what they would have done. Sadly, they also used produce that wasn't at its best anymore. They certainly had a reputation of smuggling bad meat into their pies. Yes, so the people at the bottom of society in London, when it comes to food and feeding, were definitely worse off than anywhere in the country, simply because they were so reliant on those street markets. They themselves couldn't have purchased anything fresh from the markets because that again was out of their price range. So they were reliant on whatever these food stalls provided. And that was obviously also reliant on particular seasons. So the summer probably produced nicer pottages with a lot of fresh vegetables and some off-cut meat, where this time now in particular probably was very, very basic, just a pottage with grains and some root vegetable, which you can get in England all throughout the year, like parsnip and parsnip was probably the most used one. Leek is another one, or cabbage. So you can now visualize either a pottage with some cheap bacon thrown in, grain, and some of those vegetables we've mentioned. And that would have been what they ate day in, day out. There was very little variety in their diet. And we often think, well, did they not grow tired of it, But I think if you don't know any different, you don't miss it. We know different, and therefore we can't imagine how these people could eat the same thing every day. But look at our beloved pets. I know it might be a bad example, but they eat the same every single day, and they enjoy it just as much as the day before. And I think that was very much what these people experienced. As long as they had something to eat and it made them feel full and they didn't have to go to bed hungry, that was it. They were happy.
Yeah. Do you think they understood the value of nutrition and say what we would see as the, four food groups? Did they understand that back then?
They very much did. Yes, it's so interesting when you read all these suggestions and advice given by 16th century physicians. It becomes very clear that they understood that a healthy, nutritious diet combined with happiness and regular exercise was the key to a long, healthy life. However, sometimes how they reflected that on food isn't how we would see it, but the very basic idea was very much there. And it was the nobility and the people with money, the affluent class, that very much tried to keep to such a described healthy life. But obviously, those that didn't have the funds were just happy in eating what they could. But funny enough, often they ate more healthily than the people at the top, because the people at the top, especially in early Tudor England, ate way too much meat and not enough fresh vegetables or fruit. So therefore, they had all sorts of health issues related to that, where the people down at the working class kept physically fit and had lots of fresh vegetable in their diet. So by default, therefore, ended up living a lot more healthily than their cousins at the top. Only they didn't know it then. No.
No. Henry VIII clearly didn't know. It seemed like he liked to eat a lot of meat, didn't he?
Yeah. And he didn't do any exercise in his later years. And we all know where that leads to.
Yeah, no wonder. I do have an odd question for you. In your research, I know you, excuse me, I know you've read all different kinds of books, but did you ever come across anything, stories of food poisoning? Did they understand that food could make them sick?
Right. That is one of my pet interests, funny enough. Now, there are two things. In England, poisoning by food, which in Tudor England didn't always mean that it was gone off food to start with, is a lot rarer than on the continent. There are a lot more reports about people having suffered being poisoned by food in Italy, for instance. The Italians really loved putting physically poison into their enemy's food. Big thing. You can't deny it, but very interesting. In England, however, there are very, very few cases where that has been noted. There is only one case where a cook was actually arrested and punished for having poisoned or put poison into the food. He was a Mr. Rose, and he was the cook to some. He was higher up clergy. I'd like to say he was a cardinal, but I don't think he was. No.
Well, see, now I'm flashing back to the Tudors. Was it Fisher or Moore?
No. It was nobody quite so important, but
Okay.
he is. Oh, mental blank. Anyway, the interesting thing is he's the only one who is being mentioned for having been punished for having put poison into the food, and he suffered quite a violent death. They actually boiled him to death. That was the punishment for somebody who put poison into the food. However, let's park that to one side, because I think that a lot of food poisoning, where, as we said, the Tudors actually thought about somebody having deliberately smuggled poison into the food and not necessarily the food having made people ill because it's gone off. But I recently started thinking, because my future daughter-in-law is extremely allergic to nuts, so much so that it's life-threatening. And it made me think, did Tudor England, perhaps, or Europe, see cases of such life-threatening food intolerances or allergies that would have caused similar symptoms in people, only because the Tudors didn't understand about food intolerances or food allergies, that they assumed that this person choking, dropping dead, was poisoned, where in fact it might just have been a severe nut allergy or something similar. And I am sort of on the side investigating that further.
I love that. To think this is when history becomes so fun. When you look at it, you step back a little bit and go, "Hey, hang on a second. What if this is what was really happening?" That's fascinating. I can't wait to hear more about what you find. Is that your next?
It takes some time. These things you don't discover overnight by looking at the internet. But I have one file always open where if I come across anything that could cross-link into that subject, I'll add it there.
Well,
yeah.
Let's talk about your research, because where do you find these things? Do you have to go to archives? Can you find things online? Where are you finding all of your sources?
Oh, right. Everywhere. Nothing is safe, I'd say. But yeah, most of it, like every historian, I start with books. And secondary sources often lead you to very specific pathways that enable you to see, oh, there's primary source. So I start off with a secondary book that leads me into primary sources, and those are either sometimes published, because especially if they were written originally in Latin, you can now get transcriptions and translations, very convenient. But my personal or favorites are definitely the archives, because you cannot beat holding a piece of manuscript or a book in your hands that was indeed handled by people of that period. And when you then see some annotation in the margin, oh my word, then, yeah, I'm melting. Yeah, but honestly, I look everywhere. I also talk a lot to other people, because in this field of history, everybody has a very specific area where they can call themselves an expert. And by mixing and discussing things with these people, that's when you find out more. And often they can tell you, yeah, there is one manuscript in this house. I know the person, I'll put you in touch. A lot of it is hidden behind the walls of universities. And that's my pet hate, because I think universities shouldn't be so gatekeeping, and they are terrible, absolutely terrible. They will not share with other people if you are not part of their institution. Terrible. Anyway, so a lot of it is hidden away, and you do need to know it's there, and then you often need a contact who will access it for you or open the door for you. So it is often time consuming, but well worth it to pursue if it's something you really need to do. I have had one case. I'm currently thinking about, after I finished my MA, to go into doing a PhD. But obviously, you do need to think about what are you going to research. And there's something I'd love to do. I'd like to compare the only printed cookery book from about 1500, which is at Longleat in their library, but nobody has seen it for the past 40 years. So I assume it's very, very fragile, and I don't want anybody to see it. But the thing is, I have seen the manuscript version at Hokum Hall here in Norfolk. And they were very keen, very happy for me to see it, to photograph it and work with it. And I am still trying to convince Longleat to let me take a look at it. And yeah, not easy. They haven't said no yet, but it's definitely, a long way until I get to see it, fingers crossed.
Yeah, Longleat is one of those locations that they hold the Seymour papers there as well. And of course, none of it is digitized. So in order for me to see any of it.
Yeah, exactly. But funny enough, I, by coincidence, found out that one of the curators studied at the same university as I do, and this person has agreed to see what they can do.
Ooh,
but
good.
It shouldn't be like that, They should be open. If you approach them and say, I am envisaging to study that for a PhD or whatever, can I please take a look? Or can you please send me photographs, which would be equally fine. But to just say, no. And it's the only one. It is the only printed copy left. We are pretty convinced that there were others, but that is the only one that survived. So I need this one. I have no other option.
Oh, I hope you get it. I hope that you get access to this.
Yeah, so do I. But hey, I can't force it. I can only use my charms.
Right, right. If it's meant to be, it will be. You'll get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so we talked about some sources. One of the things I'm really curious about and interested in are Tudor banquets. And I don't know, can we maybe even just start from the beginning with banquets? Like who puts it together? Who is in charge of the banquet and that like who's in charge of the food? Are there separate people for all of these things?
Right. To start with, we need to clarify what a banquet is in English terms, because a banquet in Tudor England meant something entirely different to a banquet in the rest of Europe. In the rest of Europe, a banquet was almost the same as a feast. Here in England, we made a difference, and quite an important one. So you had the feast, and for the feast, the people who were invited had their very specific place where they had to sit according to their title and their standing in society. So there was no choice where you could sit. A little bit like a wedding, you know, where you go and look for your little place, Matt. But it was strictly down to how important you were. So everybody on that long feasting table could see how important you are. And if you sat at the very end, everybody could judge you because you were a nobody, basically. Anyway, so very formal. And the feast consisted of at least 3 different courses, and every course had a number of dishes, and they mixed savory with sweet. So basically, it was like 3 help yourself courses. They would plonk everything on the table, and anything you could reach from where you sat was yours to choose from. So there was always something you wanted. You didn't necessarily have to eat everything, but very, very formal. And at the end of the banquet, when you neared the time where people were meant to get up and go, you were then asked to get up. And while you got up, you were offered a glass of hippocras, which is a spiced wine, and wafers. And that was universally the sign that, yep, that's the end of the feast. Now go home. But Tudor England developed the banquet, and the banquet was basically the second little feast that was added on to the feast, but with a much smaller group of specially invited people. And it was very informal. A banquet was basically held elsewhere but the Great Hall where the feast took place. People could mingle and talk and converse with whoever they wanted to. So that was the ideal time to chat up the lady of your heart, or, you know, vice versa. And a banquet in Tudor times was mostly sweet dessert dishes. And that was deliberate. And everything that was served could be eaten with your hands, or you basically didn't need a server to serve you. It was all about helping yourself. It was about showing off your wealth, because sugar was exceptionally expensive. So to be able to offer a whole little mini feast that catered just sweet products, to be invited to that second banquet, you really made it into society. And the food that was served was very special in that it wasn't prepared in the normal kitchen. So the feasting stuff was prepared in the kitchen. The banqueting stuff was prepared in the pastry kitchen. And wherever the nobility stayed or lived, you always had the pastry kitchen. And in the pastry kitchen, you would prepare all the banqueting stuff. That means little fruit tartlets, little fruit pies, marmalade, which in Tudor terms obviously wasn't the stuff we spread on the bread, but it was a little bit like fruit leather, so cut into pieces, and you could just enjoy it like a boiled sweet, but much nicer and softer and not so hard on your teeth. But that was basically the main difference between the feast and the banquet. And I know so many people who are not aware about this culinary difference, and they mix them up and use them interchangeably, but not in England. Everywhere else, that's fine. But Tudor England, no, they made very strict difference between the two.
Huh. Okay, so the one place that I visited when I was there in June was Hampton Court Palace, and of course I saw the kitchens there.
Yeah.
So they have the one bigger kitchen where they can turn the pig or whatever over the fire. Would their pastry kitchen have been the one right next to it?
Let me recall, the pastry kitchen in Hampton Court is either the one before. It's located at the end where they kept the fish, because pastry cooking benefits from a colder environment. Because if you've ever made pastry yourself, you know that the dough doesn't like it warm. It just doesn't work. You really need a cold surface and a cold environment. So they deliberately kept that away from the steaming hot kitchens and the spits, obviously.
Interesting. This is fascinating. I am not a cook. I'm going to be the first to say that. Growing up, I grew up on a farm. There was 4 kids, 2 girls and 2 boys, and the boys did all the work outside, and us girls tried to help where we could. But for the most part, we were kept out of the kitchen. I think my mom just liked to have her space in the kitchen. So I never really learned to cook other than what I did in school. And then when I got married, my husband at the time was the cook, so I didn't have to worry about that either. I am a baker. I prefer to bake because you have simple recipes. The recipe is right there. Just follow it and everything will turn out. When it comes to Tudor England and food, it seems like it's a fine line between cooking and baking. Would you say there's a big difference between the two, or that they're pretty similar?
They are only similar in that both have pies as part of the repertoire. But otherwise, they're very different, yes. What's interesting to note is the pastry itself played a major role in the cookery part as well as the baking part, because pastry was used in the beginning when it was often referred to as a coffin. It was only used as a cooking vessel. It was made, that pastry was made from hot water and flour only, nothing else. So you can imagine that that pastry was not nice to eat, and it wasn't intended to eat. but it was the perfect way to preserve food without refrigeration. So you would bake this meat pie, and because it excluded all air, that meat pie would keep in a cool larder for, well, at least 3 weeks without it going off. But the pastry in itself was never intended to be eaten. And the way how they served it is they just cut off the top and then spooned out the contents, and only the contents was eaten. We don't actually know what happened to the coffin pastry. Nobody ever wrote down what they did with it, but we can make educated guesses. My best suggestion is that they used it in pottages to make the pottage a bit thicker, especially in the winter.
Yeah, like a roux.
Because the Tudors didn't like wasting food, so it would not have been thrown away. Some people say they fed it to the dogs. Yeah, perhaps, but I'm not really convinced of that. Other people suggest that they gave it to the poor who liked the crust, which tasted a bit of the meat that was inside. Yeah, it is a possible option, but I think most of it went back into the cooking process in a slightly different format. And only throughout the 16th century do we see a development happening from this non-edible coffin pie crust to one that actually was consumer friendly and nice, because they discovered that if you add to the flour and the hot water eggs and butter, all of a sudden it actually becomes pleasant to eat. And you can see that happening in Tudor recipes. It didn't happen overnight. So the first half of the 16th century, you see both coffins and pastry cases. By the end of the 16th century, you no longer see coffins appear in any recipes. They've completely abolished that and just used earthenware dishes instead, because obviously the pie, that the typical Tudor pies, those really tall, big, massive things, only work with coffin-based pastry, because that's strong, that will hold. Where if you pack a edible pastry case with lots of meat and you build it up that high, you do need a different vessel to help that support the pastry while it's actually cooking. So you see that huge difference develop. And yeah, I find it fascinating again.
Yeah, this whole conversation has been fascinating today. And before we plug your book to everyone, I just have to say, Brigitte, that your background right now for this video chat that we're having is probably the coolest and most authentic Tudor looking background I have ever experienced. I've interviewed, I think, at least 100 people over the last 8 years, probably more than 100. And right now, if you're just listening to this, behind her, she has this beautiful, and I'm pretty sure it's probably what, a 16th century desk or table behind you, a tapestry hanging on the wall. Describe to people what I'm looking at.
Well, behind me, you see a serving table from around 1600, and you see a few what they call Bible boxes, which hide my junk and all the things I don't want people to see. And the wall has an early 17th century tapestry to help retain that little warmth that we create with the fire, because it is cold. And we are trying to replicate how the Tudors coped with cold houses and what was open to them to retain that little bit of warmth you created.
Yeah.
And but what you kindly haven't stressed is all the mess.
I think it looks fantastic.
Paperwork.
That looks like the perfect research setup right there. I see the books and I'm like, oh, I just want to go sit down over there and start thumbing through the pages and just dive in.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of two projects. One is due in 2 weeks, so I no longer take the time to make it look nice. It's just done with that.
What works?
Back.
And for those who don't know, why don't we talk about where you live in the house that you live in? Because I just think what you and your husband do is quite fantastic. And let's talk about that. Where is it you live? What kind of house do you live in it?
Right. We bought this house 5 years ago. It's an unusually small Tudor manor in the county of Norfolk, about 20 minutes drive from the centre of Norwich. And what attracted us to this house was that we could afford it because it needed work. It wasn't the type of house you could move in instantly and not do anything to it. So we were totally aware that it needed work, but then again, we were happy because it meant we could afford it. And, like most people, there was a budget. And we were over the moon to get it. It has some fantastic original Tudor features, like the original front door. We have some original Tudor ceilings, fireplaces, some of the floors. Yes, so in a way, the house has maintained a lot of its original features because it was mostly used as a farmhouse. So the first family who built the home, the Chamberlains, built it in the early 1500s, and that family lived here until about the mid 1600s, and then the money ran out, and they had to sell the house to another noble family here in the area, the Woodhouses. And the Woodhouses decided, right, we have our own manor house, we don't need this. And they instantly put farmers into the house we live in. Now, that it's good news and it's bad news. The good news is there never was enough money to pull it down. And hence it survived because so many Tudor buildings were demolished in the 18th century. In the 18th century, that was that century where anybody with money would raise the home they inherited down to the ground and build new. If you didn't have any money because you were a farmer put into this old Tudor manor like ours, you would just try and mend it as good as you can. Unfortunately, it also means that not all of the repair work was done professionally, as you can imagine. And interestingly, the worst bodge jobs are not from the 18th century or the 19th century. The worst ones we've discovered so far date to the 1960s to the 1980s, when previous owners decided they were not going to spend any money on professional workmen, but somebody who just was going to hide the problem. And that's our main problem at the moment. We are discovering all bits and pieces that do need attention, professional attention. And anybody who's worked on an ancient building knows you can't do that quickly. It takes time, lots of research. It has to be carried out with the fabrics and the material that's appropriate to the period. Those, again, are not easy to source. They are also very weather dependent. For instance, all the mortar we use has to be lime mortar, and everybody knows that lime mortar doesn't set if it's cold and wet. So half the year we can't actually carry on. We just have to wait, because before we replace another row of bricks, we have to wait anyway. But we are in this, and we'll see it through. It's just been taking a lot longer than we thought. But I can't wait to welcome people who want to experience real Tudor life, because that's exactly what's at the heart of our whole idea, is that people arrive here on a Friday night and they step into Tudor England and they live like a Tudor for the whole weekend. So they sit on Tudor chairs, they will be eating Tudor food, they will be enjoying Tudor music by the fire in the evening before they retire to their Tudor bed. And that's basically the whole concept, business concept we have in mind, to give people an opportunity to see what it was like to be invited to a Tudor manor. So not royalty, because people do royal feasts and this and that. We want to show people what life was like for the minor gentry. So people who didn't have to manually work for their income, but still weren't particularly wealthy, couldn't show off in the same way as Henry could, or anybody of that level.
Yeah, and this isn't new to you. You did this at your previous home, didn't you?
Yes, we did. We had a Tudor farmhouse beforehand, a little bit closer to London. But there were limitations. We didn't have enough bedrooms there. And also, it was more and more being engulfed by modern housing estates, which, if you live near London, that's what's happening. You have thousands of new houses going up within a short time, and we just felt that wasn't really giving people the right idea. They might come and stay at this Tudor farmhouse, but all around us were these new modern houses you just couldn't make disappear. So we've decided to move. But funny enough, and that's extraordinary, we weren't looking to buy a manor house. We weren't looking to move to Norfolk either. But my husband was at the time looking for a home for a friend who had lots more money than us, has to be said. So he was looking at bigger properties, and this house came up on his screen. And it instantly spoke to him. And I remember him saying, come and look at this. This is our dream house. It's got everything. It has a moat. It has a big garden, everything, enough bedrooms. It just needs work. And I looked at it and thought, we're not going to waste these people's time, Tom. That's not for us. It's not us. We can't afford that. And, And he made a booking behind my back. Lovely. And he said, I'm going to see that house anyway. I know it's way out where you wanted to go, but I've made a booking. You can either come or stay behind. Obviously, I came. And it was the only house I've ever experienced where I felt like I was coming home, even before I put a foot into it. Both of us. We got out of the car and we said, isn't that weird? It's like coming home. I feel like I've come home. And it was such a strong feeling. And yeah, it hasn't changed. We still feel like it. And we do think there's a presence here. You know, we don't call it ghosts because we don't see any ghosts. We don't see funny things being moved from A to B. But there is a very supportive, strong element that picks us up when we're down, and we can't explain it. It's almost like the house wants us to carry it on. It points us to where there is a problem that wasn't obvious before. It's the house is talking to us, and it's also looking after us, which is lovely. Yeah, I do like that. I do remember the first winter we moved in, a cupboard of mine had a dodgy foot and it fell onto me. But out of nowhere, I had the strength with one hand to push it back and with my foot push something underneath to stabilize it. I tried that again afterwards. So since then, I think there's definitely something here that wants us to be here. That definitely, I look at this house as my guardian angel.
Oh, it sounds so lovely. I just feel like even though it's probably very stressful to own a old home like that, what a dream come true for anyone who is fascinated with history or even Tudor history. Like this is and you're making these wonderful recipes, these authentic Tudor recipes and this authentic manor house. You're living the dream.
Yeah, it is my dream, yes. And at the moment, my biggest project is actually taking place outside in the garden. Because, when you do Tudor authentic cookery, you need Tudor authentic seasonal vegetables. So one fed directly into the other. So I'm now working on my authentic Tudor vegetable garden. And I've even made that into my dissertation. And there's a book coming out about it as well. But I can't tell much more about it. But if you're interested or you're thinking about putting Tudor garden elements into your own backyard, there's a book coming.
Yes. Well, in the meantime, if you want to check out Brigitte's book, Eating with the Tudors, where can they find it?
You can get it from Amazon in America as well as in England. If you don't like Amazon, you can order it directly from the publishers. That's Pen and Sword here in England, but there is an American outlet as well. Or if you want a signed and dedicated copy, you can always get in touch with me, and I'm happy to post it anywhere in the world.
And if they want to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
I am on almost all of social media outlets, platforms. So either Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Threads, or even Blue Sky. Yeah. Wow. Either my name or Tudor, I think Tudor Food Recipes is my other name, but Brigitte Webster will get you there. There's only one Brigitte Webster that does Tudor cookery.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today and chatting with me again. It has been so much fun to learn about all this with you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really had a blast. Really lovely talking about my passion. And we've got to do it more often.
Yes, yes, we do. Oh, that's a promise. I'll make a promise.
Yeah. And next time you come to England, try to come a bit further east.
I need to. That's why every time I come there, I keep thinking I stay too far south. I have to travel out a little bit more, huh?
Yeah, yeah. Well, don't forget, Norwich was the second largest city in Tudor England. And it's also known as the best preserved Tudor city in England. So
Oh, I'll have to add it to my list. Thank you, Brigitte.
thank you.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.